Welcome to Joey Jackson on the Law. Hi, this is Joey Jackson on the Law, where we are talking all things Epstein, the Epstein files. So important, so significant to many. Why? Because this was a person we know that he committed suicide back in 2019. Or did he? It's an open theory as to whether or not he's still alive. Maybe he's on his private island. Maybe he's somewhere else. But those things are things that people talk about regularly with respect to him still being here. Now, on the Epstein files, it's a source of much debate everywhere. Why is it a source of debate? It's a source of debate because of the abuse that he engaged in with so many young girls. Yes, as young as 14, 1,200 survivors. What do we want to unpack first? How is it that we got Congress to act? It's hard to get Congress to act on anything, but they acted here, and they acted almost unanimously. That they can't even decide whether their name, if they debated a congressperson's name, whether that would be unanimous. But here, in order to get accountability and to have the release of these Epstein files, there was almost unanimous, we'll talk about that in a little while, consent with respect to passing this law. What law am I talking about? I am talking about the Epstein Transparency Act. Now, Congress debated it. Why? Because we have these files. What files? We have files that exist with respect to Jeffrey Epstein. Over the course of decades, he was abusing these young victims, these girls, trafficking them, engaging in sexual activities with them, exposing them and using their bodies for his pleasure, getting these massages, making all kinds of promises to them about their lives, about their future, about what he would do, about how he can help elevate them. But that was a ruse. Why? Because it was all for his self-gratification. And so, in that regard, you had Congress that said, we want to learn more about this. And what happened as a result of that? Well, what happened is that you had Jeffrey Epstein, who escaped accountability for years. How did he escape accountability? He escaped accountability in as much as they had him, they being the state of Florida. They had him in their clutches. We know they had him in their clutches because they investigated him. And ultimately, what they ended up doing was charging him. Now, of course, because he's a billionaire, he got off easy. Talk about that later. But we know that as a result of what he was doing with these girls, there was an investigation. The federal government had an opportunity to put him away for life. Did they do it? No. He ended up pleading guilty to state charges, 2 prostitution charges, although there were a dozen 14-year-olds that testified about his misdeeds. And there was a draft of an indictment that had about 60 counts on it. But I'm a billionaire, never mind. I'm going to sidestep that. And he did. And so he continued to engage in these activities. And finally, it caught up with him many years later in 2019, where he was indicted. Now, as a result of that indictment, he was going to stand to be held accountable in a court of law. But before he could be held accountable, after he was charged and while he was being detained, he committed suicide again, or did he? Right? That will be up to you to determine based upon the facts. But we know that it sparked outrage, and finally Congress, right, that is the United States House of Representatives, there's 435 of them, and there, of course, in addition to that, is the United States Senate, there's 100 of them. They decided to come together to do something with respect to the release of the files. Now, let's be clear. The President of the United States has the authority to release these files, or had that authority, without the particular consent of anyone. The President could have, on his own, unilaterally, as the Commander-in-Chief and the commander of this country, decided that I want these files to be released. President did not do so. So as a result of that, you had Congress that had to take action to pass a law that would mandate the release. Now, we know that Congress, they're always debating everything, and very few times do they come together and essentially say, in a bipartisan way, Democrats, Republicans, particularly in this polarized society, that we're going to take action and we're going to do something like get them to release those files. Now, why do they want the files? They wanted the files because there was a feeling and a sense that because Jeffrey Epstein avoided accountability, we want other accountability. Now, we know, of course, that Ghislaine Maxwell, his longtime associate, girlfriend, friend, whatever you want to call her, was later prosecuted after that. But that wasn't enough. People wanted to know, who were his associates? What was the money like? What was he doing with respect to these associates and other people? Who were his enablers? Who was assisting him to get these women girls at that time to come forward for his self-gratification. There had to be more. Where were those interests? How far did it extend? What was he doing? When was he doing it? And so as a result of that, what they ended up doing was passing this Epstein Transparency Act to get to the bottom of it. How? Because if you get to the bottom of the files and you release the files, you can then determine what was he doing? What was he doing it with? Who were his associates? When was he associating with them? Over what period of time? Where was he spending his time? Where was he engaging in this trafficking? Was he flying them domestically in the United States? Was he taking them outside of the United States to other places? If he was doing that, what specifically was he engaged in doing that? How was he transporting them? Who were the people involved? How were they involved? What were they doing? And so Congress felt it appropriate to pass the Epstein Transparency Act so that the Department of Justice can release these files so that the public can see for ourselves exactly what's in them and specifically who was involved in this whole process of allowing this to happen for such an extended period of time. And so we then had this law, which I will talk about, involving the Epstein Transparency Act, where the files were finally mandated to be released. We are discussing all things Epstein. Now, people have had questions with regard to the process of how these files got released. I'm going to tell you how, because we're going to go through the timeline now of Congress. Yes, your Congress, those people that we pay to represent us, right? Taxpayer dollars. We have them. They exist for our representation. They exist to pass laws. They exist for our protection. Well, they finally, sorry for the criticism, but it's warranted, decided to come together. And they came together by passing the Epstein Transparency Act. Now, let's talk about the timeline, because there's pretty critical dates here, okay? We know that it's really a close call in Congress with respect to the country being divided. Republicans are in charge now. And of course, as we've noted, the president could have passed this Epstein Transparency Act, not the law itself, but could have released the Epstein files that would have avoided the need for an Epstein Transparency Act. That didn't happen. In any event, Congress then decided to act. So on September 20th of 2025, this is when that bill was introduced. What bill? The bill that talks about releasing those Department of Justice files, allowing the public to see what is in the Epstein files. Where was he doing? What was he doing? With whom, etc. Release them all wherever they may be so that we all can get a look for ourselves about who was involved in this extended and significant and just earth-shattering array of abuse involving 1,200 victims. And so September 20th, 2025 comes about. Congress introduces a bill. Congratulations, Congress. Thereafter, on November 18th of 2025, they passed the bill. Now, they passed the bill 427 to 1. Imagine that. There's one dissent. 427 say, we want this. Now, we know there's 435 members of Congress. Where were the other 7 members? Your guess is as good as mine. The bill passes. It then goes to the United States Senate because it takes 2 chambers. And it's sent to the Senate the day after that, on November 19th of 2025. What does the Senate do? They pass it unanimously. That's right. That means all 100 of them have decided that we want this transparency law in existence. Now, we know that the president, Trump, he was against releasing any of these files. And as I noted, he could have done it by himself. But when the writing was on the wall and when Congress really, in a breathtaking way, came together in a bipartisan way, we don't care if you're a Democrat, we don't care if you're a Republican, we're passing this law. President all of a sudden says, hey, yeah, pass the law, I'm all good. And so on the 19th, he signs it as well. And in signing the law, there were certain specific protocols that were designated to be followed. What was that? The first of which was that these files were going to be released and needed to be released within 30 days. That's right. On December 19th of 2025, there was a mandate that every single thing be released. Now, when we say every single thing, just quickly, I have to talk to you about things in terms of protocols. Number 2, that were protected. Certainly, it's fair game if there's classified information that not be made public. Anything relating to national security should not be made public. Anything relating to the private victim's information, right? Names, date of birth, social security numbers, banking information, not to be released. Anything relating not only to those issues, but relating to other issues such as what? Issues if there's an active investigation, if there's an ongoing prosecution, not to be released because you want to have certain measures of protection, right? That's what we called redacting. You redact out information that you don't want to be publicly released. And that was the essence of it, right? Of what should be redacted, what should not be. Now, in terms of what shouldn't be redacted, if it caused reputational harm, too bad, so sad. If it was going to embarrass you, too bad, so sad. If you're a politician, so what? A foreign dignitary, again, so what? If you're a celebrity, doesn't matter. The only things that should be redacted are, as I noted, national security, private information, depictions of child pornography or child abuse or death and that type thing. Take it out. These ongoing investigations to protect the integrity, right? You take that out. Everything else was supposed to be released within 30 days. Did that happen? Of course it didn't happen. So on the 19th, we get, and we know now that there's millions of files. They released 3,900, right, of this information. And so obviously there was a public outcry like, what are you talking about? We're supposed to get the whole files. What are you obstructing? Why aren't you releasing it? So from the 20th of December to the 23rd of 2025, you had these 3 additional tranches of information that was sent out to the public. Heavy redactions. What do I mean when I say redactions? Redactions, what I mean by that are that there are instances where things are blacked out, right? They're blacked out. We can't see exactly what's happening. So people say, I want the full files. And then, of course, come January 30th of 2026, now we get millions of files. We get 3.5 million approximately. We get 180,000 images. We get 2,000 videos. Now they're coming around, but there's still a problem. What's the problem? Things are missing. Things are redacted. Some things are not redacted. So what happened was there was major criticism. The criticism was, of course, warranted based upon the massive delay. Why aren't you complying with the law? Based upon the massive redactions, what's all this information looking like? Where is it? You just see black and black and black. I want to know what actually happened. And then, of course, you had sloppy redactions because you had victim information, even nude photos of victims. That was all over the place. But yet you had people who were billionaires whose names were redacted and missing. So the victims wanted to know, why are you outing us, exposing us to death threats, exposing us to otherwise invading our privacy, but yet billionaires, you get to hide behind that. And so the mass issues relating to the issue of redaction, issues of obstructing, you're protecting people, why aren't you doing this? And then, of course, we come to know that all of this information relating to a witness who accused President Trump of abuse as an underage person, underage girl, that's entirely missing. So you could know and understand that that was a major issue, which led to major problems. And then, of course, the issue becomes what you can do about it. Now, Congress didn't put anything in terms of what you can do about these disputes, and that became a major problem. Now, here's the issue. The issue is that we know that there's been much criticism about the Department of Justice and them dragging their feet over the release of these files, them redacting information too heavily. You know what redacting is. They black it out. You can't see, right? It looks like Swiss cheese, but it's black, right? And you don't know what it is that you're looking at. Victims, oh, we're going to expose their names. No problem. Billionaires, oh, we're going to protect them. We're going to redact them. We're going to black that out. The issue is that the law did not speak to how you resolve that problem in terms of whether there's a dispute. Now, let me be clear. The law spoke to it in a very clear way by saying, hey, Department of Justice, if you're redacting something, you have to give a specific explanation and it has to comport with the law. Has the Department of Justice done that? Of course not. And as a result of that, there's a problem because there's nothing in the law that says what you then do next when there's a dispute as to what DOJ, Department of Justice, does. And so you not only have these redactions, but you have another issue about, well, what are you doing? If you're delaying and information is missing, it's not only redacted, but we know there are other files, but you're holding on to them, such as the files they've been accused of holding on with Donald Trump, such as information in terms of other billionaires that are redacted and hidden, right? What are we supposed to do about this? Because the law doesn't speak to that. Well, I'm going to tell you, all right? So there's existing law that you can apply that relates to what exactly you do. Now, what's the first thing? The first thing is that you can have these congressional proceedings where you can hold the Department of Justice in contempt. That's right. Pam Bondi, in the Department of Justice, hold her in contempt, hold her deputies in contempt, hold anyone associated with not releasing this information in a position of authority in contempt. Well, that's not going to happen. Why? Because a contempt finding by Congress requires a vote. The Republicans control Congress. The Republicans control the presidency. Do you really think that the Congress that's controlled by the Republicans is going to issue a contempt finding against one of their own? And do you really think that if they issued a contempt finding, which leads to criminal prosecution, that ultimately you're sending a criminal prosecution to the Department of Justice that does prosecutions and they're going to prosecute their own people? Highly unlikely. So that one's not going to work too well. Now, there's also the judicial issue that can be done, and that is the appointment of a special master. What does that mean? It means that a judge now would be appointed, and a judge, having been appointed, would be responsible for overseeing this whole Epstein issue. If there are issues about redactions, the judge will decide. If there's issues about missing information, the judge will decide. If there are issues concerning any dispute, because the judge will be the special master, the judge would now decide. Now, there's been issues with that, and the judges have been not inclined to get involved, talking about issues about whether they have, that as judges, the authority to tell the Department of Justice what to do. Issues concerning whether or not a judge would be in a position to do that. So those have been resisted. What has happened, though, is that judges have held the Department of Justice accountable, and the Department of Justice has voluntarily agreed to correct the error when they released this information. Can't unring a rung bell, but at least they took out private information relating to victims. At least they now are more cooperative with respect to unredacting names, that is, allowing them that they shouldn't have redacted in the first place to be made public. There's also been Congress that have now had the opportunity to go into these reading rooms and actually look and evaluate this information on their own. Only Congress is saying, hey, we went into these reading rooms to look at the unredacted information, and guess what? It's redacted. So what do we now do? So that's been a problem, not to mention the Department of Justice spying on the searches they're making while they're in the reading rooms in terms of what they're reading. So that's a problem. The other issue in terms of accountability is a civil lawsuit. We know that the victims have filed a class action lawsuit against the Department of Justice. Why? Because there's a Privacy Act. Do you want your driver's license to be all over the internet? Do you want nude photos of you to be all over the internet? Do you want your banking information, your social security number? Of course not. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. Not only that, but in exposing them, these victims, of course, in addition to the humiliation and embarrassment and frustration, they're also alleging that they're getting death threats. And so there's this lawsuit. But again, as a result of that lawsuit, which I think certainly will and should result in monetary damages in the millions for the survivors that have been impacted by the carelessness of the Department of Justice, there's been an agreement by the Department of Justice voluntarily. In fact, they were going to have a hearing on the issue. That's when you come in court and the sides decide to make an argument as to their perspectives. That was canceled because the Department of Justice said, my bad, I made a mistake. And yes, we shouldn't have released the information of these victims. We're so sorry about that. And we shouldn't have actually redacted these billionaires who were involved. And we've made other errors, but we'll correct it on our own. But that's the way that that's happening. But a judge has not, to this point, been as heavy-handed as to take over that process, although we'll see what happens moving forward. The other and last thing, very briefly, relates to this issue of criminal liability. Now, let's be clear about that. You cannot obstruct an investigation. I'm going to quote it. Okay, I'm going to quote it. It's 18 USC. It's a criminal code, 18 USC 2071. And what that says is that if you're willfully concealing information, you're hiding information, we got a problem. You're removing records, that's hiding information, we got a problem. Now, they won't be prosecuted now, those who are doing it at the highest levels of the Department of Justice. Why? Because they control the Justice Department. Why? Because the President of the United States would issue a pardon, right? Why? Because the Republicans control everything. But be careful, because there's a 5-year statute of limitations. And so when you're out of office, who knows what accountability could exist then? So I say, again, favorite expression, that which is done in the dark comes out in the light. And that light might result in criminal prosecutions if the Department of Justice is doing things, hiding, concealing, misrepresenting, that they should not be doing. All right? So be careful lest you transgress the law. This is Joey Jackson on the law, where we are talking all things Epstein. Why? Because inquiring minds would like to know. Now, the release of the Epstein files, they've been slow, they've been sloppy, and they've been somewhat problematic. That's an understatement, but we've learned an awful lot as a result of their release. Now, let's talk about some major takeaways. Now, a major takeaway, let me not hide the ball, and because I'm Captain Obvious, I'll state it. Epstein was a very wealthy guy. But what we did learn in terms of his wealth is that the wealth wasn't as we thought, right? We thought he was this brilliant financier who made his money the right way, the honest way, the noble way. Not so fast. There seems to be the making of money through fraud. That's an easy way. Through lies, through manipulation, through misappropriation, through a whole bunch of other things that would have him stealing money as opposed to actually earning the money. So that's somewhat troubling. And so those of you who thought that he was this person who just got all this wealth and he did it the old-fashioned way, not so fast. Although he was kind of smart in concealing his money because he moved to the Virgin Islands and they have these certain tax advantages and he took advantage of these tax loopholes. Don't fault him for that if it's your money. But he took advantage of those tax loopholes to the tune of over $300 million. And so not only did he steal the money, but he was really smart about keeping the money and not letting the government get it in terms of the tax advantages that he got. Now, we also learn, in addition to this wealth that he acquired through means of fraud and misappropriation and lies and the rest of it, we also learn that the government bent over backwards to protect this guy. It was absolutely incredible what we learned with respect to how the government covered for him. I guess when you have all of this money and all of these rich and powerful friends, you pretty much can do what you want. And I thought that we had a system in the United States where no one was above the law. Not so fast. Not if you're Jeffrey Epstein. Not if you got private planes. Not if you got islands all over the place. Not if you could transport people internationally and do what you want. Apparently, his money was enabling him to do a lot, but the government was enabling to do even more. They had, that is the government, Jeffrey Epstein in their clutches. They had him. How do we know that? Because in Florida, he was cold busted. They got him in this investigation in 2006, 2007, involving his ultimate conviction. He pled guilty in 2008, but there was this draft indictment. I kid you not. You cannot make this stuff up. It was a federal indictment that was 45 to 60 pages, involving about 60 counts of misconduct and sex trafficking, something that would keep you in jail for the rest of your life. Not if you're Jeffrey Epstein. So what happened to this draft document? What happened is they buried it. Yep, that's right. You heard me. They buried the draft document and decided to allow him to plead guilty to state charges, okay, with this sweetheart deal where, get this, he did 13 months, but he didn't do it in jail, right? No. He didn't do it in jail. He had this quote unquote work release, and that work release allowed him to go to his office so that he would not be in jail. So he was anywhere but jail. He got this light 13-month sentence that he ultimately served, where he was doing whatever he wanted to do. And not only that, but there was an immunity agreement that was negotiated for his friends. Unbelievable. And so we learned a lot about the government's protection, and we learned a lot about the U.S. attorney, Alex Acosta, who approved of this sweetheart deal. Wow. Unbelievable. Nice to be rich, nice to be famous, nice to be connected. And so Jeffrey Epstein escaped because of the fact that he had all of these connections. You used his wealth in a way that was abusive, of course, with respect to the people he knew, but more importantly, with regard to the victims who he was abusing regularly, repeatedly, constantly. Yep, 14-year-olds. But we also learned a lot else, right? We learned the extent of his connection. This guy knew everybody. He was rolling, talk about rolling with the big dogs. He was rolling with them all, right? He was rolling with the president, the now president of the United States, Trump's. Yep, Bill Gates, rolling with him too. Elon Musk, Bill Clinton. The list goes on and on. Steve Bannon. Listen, if I told you the list of the names in the Epstein files involving the rich, the powerful, the well-connected, I list the whole podcast would be for multiple days about people who have these connections that he was essentially engaged in whatever relationships with. If you talk to the people now, oh, didn't know him. I knew him, but he was only a casual acquaintance. Oh, I knew him. I ran into him once or twice on his private island, but I didn't know anything that he was doing. But we learned a lot with regard to the people that he was hanging around with. Now, just to be clear, again, that what you do in the dark comes out in the light. This was not without consequence. What do you mean consequence? Well, what I mean is be careful who you act around and what you do, because there's always tomorrow. Not that this is a singing podcast, but you get what I'm saying. The fact is that after this happened, a lot of things happen. And what do we know? We know about the arrest of Prince Andrew. Yeah, Prince Andrew. He's in Britain. That's how long and how wide his extensions extended, right? He had connections everywhere. And so Prince Andrew was ultimately arrested for issues relating to Epstein. We got another podcast coming for you. That's a treat on Prince Andrew himself. But Prince Andrew arrested as a result of it. There was a foreign dignitary. We'll talk about that also. Prime Minister of Norway also arrested. But Norway, what are we talking about? The Epstein files? Yes. He was former prime minister of Norway. We know that we have now calls for Trump to testify himself because of the sheer length and the amount of times that he appears in the Epstein files. We know that there are government officials who enabled him for years who are being called now before this oversight committee, and the oversight committee that's investigating the case, podcast on that as well, about who they are, what they do, but I digress, who are being called to say, look, what are you guys doing? And what were you doing to allow this to happen? Yes, they're calling this committee before them former FBI directors, not alleging anybody did anything wrong, just alleging that if you got this information, what have you done with it? Former attorney generals of the United States, again, not alleging anyone did anything wrong to this point, just alleging that he was rich and powerful and connected. And so we learned a heck of a lot about all of these things, but most importantly, and I'm going to leave it with this, we learned about the survivors and about the abuse and about the depth of the abuse and the length of the abuse and the ages of these 14-year-olds and his specific conduct and what he was doing and who he was doing it to and where he was engaged in these activities and the promises he was making. And it's just an awful lot, to say the least, with regard to what he was allowed to get away with, Jeffrey Epstein, the extent of time he was allowed to get away with it, and how he was caught and he was essentially let go and given a pass. Instead of spending the rest of his life in jail back in 2008, he was allowed to engage in another decade's worth more of abuse of these young girls when he could have been stopped. And so now is the point for accountability. And that's why you had Congress get together to pass this law to get these files, to ensure that there would be accountability for everyone and anyone who might have been involved with him in doing the things that he was actually doing. And upon his death, we know that he had this net worth of $600 million or so. But we also know that that's dwindled significantly based upon the fact of these legal fees and the survivor payouts and settlements, etc., because that, again, what you do in the dark comes out in the light. This has been Joey Jackson on the Law. So grateful you can join us. Stay tuned, subscribe, look for me, find me, and you're going to learn a lot more about Jeffrey Epstein and these files. God bless and stay safe.